Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Greetings and a fine good morning from the shores of Southern Oregon on a rainy, stormy day to another hour of discernment on March 1st, 2016. Well, I got up a little bit early this morning and I read the chapter that we're going to be talking about today, and I have to admit that this chapter and this study and Michael D. Semblin, I have to write this chapter. Understand, he has to leave out. excuse me. He has to leave out a lot. I mean, he's going to give us we're going to go through some history from the time of Henry VIII to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And so he can't, when an author's writing a book, he just can't put everything in the book. So anyway, but what he's got in the book has really rocked my boat, because I realized that I've went along in life, and I realized I've said to this, the word Jesuit was not in my vocabulary. And then the truth of it is, most people in this world today, the word Jesuit is not in their vocabulary. I'll give you a little example. I have a book alongside me here. It's about 600 pages. It's a history of the Jesuits in England. Now, I haven't read it, but it's a whole book written about the Jesuits in history. So I didn't, Jesuit, the word Jesuit isn't in my vocabulary, but the word Arminianism was not in my vocabulary even maybe 6 months ago. Was not in my vocabulary. And so with that anyway, listen, Larry Phillips is coming back and to help read this book, because God has blessed myself because Arminianism has been in Larry's vocabulary from a child, and but he didn't understand it as much as he knows today. But it's a blessing to have Larry Phillips with me today, because Larry Phillips has come down a different path. And Walt Stickles come down a different path. We all come down different paths. And the more I've said this numerous times when I'm talking, is history is important, but the most important part now is to be Christ-centered. If you're not Christ-centered, you cannot see some of these things that are out in history. But the most important thing is to be Christ-centered. And you see, what we're discussing here today with Arminianism in this chapter is we're talking about a man-centered religion, which is Arminianism. And the Bible is Christ-centered from the very first verse in the Bible. So anyway, I kind of, this chapter has kind of moved me, Larry. I didn't mean to talk so much, but welcome to the broadcast, Larry.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to just reiterate, last night we listened to Mike McGinnis, and he made a statement. I'd never heard this. I'm sure you have. I think maybe I've heard either yourself or Mike say this, but it's new to me. But Mike said, I was asking Mike about his thoughts about history and the validity of it, and he talked about how much we can learn from history. But you know what he said? He said, Larry, you probably heard this before, but he said, the true history, regardless of what history you're reading, the true history is his story. I never I had never heard that before.
I've heard it, but I've heard it before, but never in that perspective.
Yeah, yeah. And so what we're reading, is his story, because he's behind it all. I mean, he's sovereign over this whole mess with the Jesuits and the Roman Catholics and the Reformation and even prior to that. And so anyway, I don't want to get wordy, but we're doing his story.
and also that what I gleaned from what Mike said last night is that the most important part is to be Christ-centered.
Right.
I mean, to move you, and you see, I want to say this too, that that all of this false doctrines that we see in the world today comes from Ignatius Loyola's spirituality. All of it, every bit of it, and we're going to get into it in this chapter. Because anyway, we'll go ahead and start, Larry. This is chapter 12 on page 119 in Michael DeSemblin's book, The Foundations Under Attack, The Roots of Apostasy, by Michael DeSemblin.
And I'll just say that, Walt, you're the from 119 to 125, you have much more knowledge of this than Larry Phillips. Your history is much stronger in this particular area. So feel free to jump in any time, because I'm a little lame in this. Catholicism and Arminianism in England and France during the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. The 16th century Council of Trent was convened on December 13, 1545, ostensibly to discuss the reformation of the Roman Catholic Church. This was merely a subterfuge, or to date, language spin. In reality, the purpose was to exonerate the Church from its widespread identification as the Antichrist of Scripture, and to attack and condemn the doctrines of the Reformation, particularly the doctrine of free and sovereign grace. It declared these to be anathema. Unlike the other councils and synods we have considered in this section, the decrees of this ecumenical council have no validity whatsoever for saints of God, for Trent was an instrument of the papacy to counter the Reformation. It was set up hot on the heels of the Roman Church's Inquisition, which was instituted by Pope Paul III in 1544 to combat Protestantism. Looking again at Trent, its decree and dogmas, we can demonstrate to Arminians that they can find their cherished semi-Pelagian views on free will enshrined in the decrees of this notorious council. Whilst Trent officially condemned the teachings of Pelagius, it succeeded in tacitly restating them, employing the disingenuousness and theological double talk which has been the hallmark of the Jesuit order. They call that the Hegelian dialectic, I think. The same equivocation and prevarication displayed by Pelagius and Arminius were to be found in abundance in this council. From start to finish...
I comment there, Larry.
Yeah,
I just want to comment again, see what the author said. He said, in the theological double talk, which has been the hallmark of the Jesuit order, that's Ignatius Loyola spirituality.
Yeah.
Once you see, in other words, you say, well, the Jesuits, we always talk about the Jesuits. Well, how do they work? Do they stand on a corner with AK-47s? Do they have armies? Do they have physically armies? No. It's their spirituality that they attack with. That's what we see so prevalent today. And Arminianism is the seed. It's a seed, and it's as time has gone. This is now we're talking in this chapter, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. They're talking about how they planted the seeds. That's how the Jesuits work. They infiltrate, educate, and agitate. And that's what they do in all the seminaries and the Bible colleges. That's where dispensational futurism comes from, and that's where Arminianism comes from. So, go ahead, Larry.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because the spiritual exercises, you're absolutely right. So what this really is showing us, and it's showing me, really, it's showing me the linkage when he makes the statement that the Arminians that can find their cherished semi-Pelagian views on free will enshrined in the decrees of this notorious council, whilst Trent officially condemned the teachings of Pelagius, it succeeded in tacitly restating, employing the ingenious, disingenuous, and double talk, which has been the hallmark of the Jesuit order. So that really opens my eyes a lot right there. So they say one thing and then they say something else. It's wow. Okay, from start to finish, it was characterized by corruption, bribery, deceit, and duplicity. Even its claim to be called ecumenical council was misleading. The Jesuits had seen to it that it was packed with placemen and cronies, closely resembling the First Vatican Council in 1870, which voted through papal infallibility. The vast majority of bishops in attendance were Italians, many of them from a diocese especially created by the Pope, so that they would represent his views and ensure that he would get his way, which of course he did.
Comment?
Yeah.
When I read this, and when you touched on the word, you see, in other words, they're the ones that have coined the word ecumenical.
Yeah.
And they did it at the Council of Trent.
Wow.
You see, I could tell the way you read that word that you picked up on it exactly like I did this morning at 5:00 when I read this chapter. It's amazing. Wow. It's amazing.
Wow. That is amazing. I did not know that.
I didn't either until 5:00 this morning.
That opens a whole new understanding of the current day ecumenical movement right there.
Coming from the Council of Trent.
Yeah, absolutely. And he even says in here, its claim was misleading. It was very misleading. They're trying to act like they're, wanting to reach out and have unity with everybody. Wow. The canons of the Council of Trent are still binding on all Catholics to this day and are part of the dogma of the Church of Rome. So we could say that this duplicity, this ecumenical council, is still part of the dogma of the Church of Rome. Wow. That was my comment.
Yeah. Right.
They oppose the core beliefs of the Reformation on free grace and justification, stress that salvation is impossible without adherence to these canons. They proclaim the Arminian view, free will being exalted over the sovereign grace of God. It's perhaps worth taking note of the irony that many who subscribe to these Tridentine views assert that Calvinism has its roots in Romanism, with their own Arminian soteriology, was so firmly affirmed at this notorious council of the ancient enemy of the saints of God. Wow, there's an awful lot to take in on that, Walt.
I know. This morning, like I said, when you read this, I will say this. I'm going to be posting this part 3. I have it in a PDF file. Part 3. Part 3, I have the whole thing, Arminianism and a man-centered gospel. So tomorrow I'll have a link and I'll put it up on the on Hour of Discernment.
Yeah, honestly,
page.
This is kind of shocking. I had not read this, of course, and I didn't know what we were really going to be covering today. This is kind of shocking to me, to be honest with you. It's all I'm covering new ground here, folks.
Well, and also he's going to get into we're going to get into some history. He's going to bring the history all the way to the Glorious Revolution, and so we're going to see how this Arminian seed, because it didn't plant overnight.
Right.
It didn't. I mean, what we see in the world today didn't happen overnight. I mean, this has been 400 years.
Yeah, that's wow. We make reference to Trent for another reason. It proved to be a watershed in the rapid ascendancy of Arminianism to its place of prominence in the church of our day. We shall see how both Roman Catholic monarchs and Anglo-Catholic Arminian prelates took the canons of Trent as a license to disenfranchise, persecute, torture, and murder the true saints of God after the manner of the Papal Inquisition. Whoa. The Council of Trent. The infamous Council of Trent had been in session for some 8 years when Mary Tudor ascended the throne of England in 1553. In the words of Wetzel, quote, "Bloody Queen Mary made England Catholic again," end quote. The year after her coronation, she married Philip II of Spain, and very quickly the Catholic persecution of Protestants began, decreed by the Council of Trent and carried out by the Inquisition.
Okay, comment?
Yeah.
One thing I want, and the author refers to it, he says, ascended the throne. What it was, it's going to. He doesn't say it in this paragraph, but understand when we read this, that she only reigned for 5 years, and she died of a cancer. And if you can see the hand of God. She reigned for 5 years. She was unable to bear a son. If she'd been healthy, and she married the king of she married Philip II of Spain, which was Catholic, and if she'd have lived, if she would have had a son, we would have had a dynasty. But she only lived 5 years, so keep that in mind. And in 5 years, that's when Elizabeth I, because Mary was her father was Henry VIII, and so was Elizabeth.
Yeah,
they had different mothers, and Elizabeth wasn't expected to get to reign. She would have never reigned, because they were both about the same. No, Elizabeth was younger, but in other words, she probably would have never got a chance to reign if Mary hadn't died, and that's why she's called Bloody Mary. And that's why when you go to a bar and ask for I'll have a Bloody Mary, that's what it means. That's where that drink came from. And what got me this morning when I read that too is I never looked at it as God being sovereign, and the fact that she only reigned for 5 years. So
right.
So the next thing you're going to read is from an Arminianist from the track, Another Gospel by William McLean. So go ahead, Larry.
Okay. Quote, in reference to the Calvinistic doctrine, the doctrines of free and sovereign grace held by the Reformers in England, Toplady observes, Queen Mary and her Spanish husband well known that Calvinism is the very life and soul of the Reformation, and that popery would never flourish till the Calvinistic doctrines were eradicated. Her efforts to destroy by sword and faggot those who upheld the truth earned for her the unenviable appellation of Bloody Mary. The charge on which many of them were burned at the stake was that they held to the doctrine of predestination and rejected the Arminian and Popish doctrine of free will.
Take your breath away.
Yeah. So that was the primary reason why they were being martyred and burned at the stake, was because they were not upholding free will. Wow. Yet, as J.C. Ryle reminded us late in the 19th history, quote, a very popular history of our English queen hardly mentions the martyrdoms of Queen Mary days. Yet Mary was not called Bloody Mary without reason, and scores of Protestants were burned in her reign. It is as certain as that the Romish Church burned our reformers as it is that William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings. Mary Tudor so detested free grace that life alone was wanting to her to have completely overthrown the Reformation in England and have placed again the kingdom beneath the Romish yoke. During the short reign of Bloody Mary, John Rogers, translator of the Matthew Bible, Bishop Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and 281 other men and women were martyred. Whoa, my goodness. In the 17th century, during the reign of the four Stuart kings, James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, Arminianism grew to become the prevalent faith of the Church of England. Wow. That right there is new. That's new stuff to me. Okay. I didn't know that Arminianism was that present during all of those reigns within the Church of England, and made considerable progress in Scotland too. James I, although himself a Calvinist in soteriology, a robust Calvinist Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, favored high churchmen who accepted his doctrine of the divine right of kings that tended to be Arminian in sympathy.
A comment?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, see, James I was, is the one the King James Version is named after. Charles I is his son. Charles II and James II are the sons of Charles I.
Oh, okay.
But keep in mind, there's four. Of the four here, Charles I is the one that was executed during the English Civil War.
Okay.
And in other words, and also I want just to see how did it infiltrate? James I, he still held on to divine rights. See, but his son Charles I married a Catholic. So we know what happens when in marriage. He became a Catholic.
Exactly.
He became a Catholic. James was not a Catholic. James I, his father wasn't, but it's no different than it is in 2016 when you raise a family and drop them out into an Arminian world. What are they going to become?
Yeah, almost across the board. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, let's keep that in mind as we continue here, because it gets better.
William Laud, who became Archbishop of Canterbury under Charles I, was one of them. Led by Laud and greatly disliking Puritans, Charles promoted many Arminians as prelates. Absolute personal predestination has come to be thought of as a distinctly Puritan assertion, and when after 1660 the Restoration set the pendulum swinging against all that Puritans had stood for, Calvinism had the status of an oddity maintained by nonconformists. Anglican theologians, with few exception, were Arminian in type, as indeed they are still. That's very interesting to me. It's just very interesting. I see that there is absolute proof that if a person doesn't know his story, his history, this fills in a lot of blanks for me. Okay.
Yeah. In other words, what Mike was saying last night, it's his story.
Right.
Mike McGinnis. Now it's all making perfect sense.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, because I knew that there was this swinging back and forth between sovereign grace and Catholicism, but now I more fully understand how it took place through these different reigns of these different kings. In the 20 years from Laud's being made a bishop in 1621 until his imprisonment in the Tower of London in 1640, he wreaked almost single-handedly more havoc and destruction on our nation and on the cause of God's truth than any other individual professing Christian in our history. Wow. Even from 1602, go ahead.
No, that's a pretty profound statement, because
yeah.
I'm getting ready to comment as we get down a little bit further here.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Even from 1602, while he was still at the university, Laud became a marked man and known as a very lukewarm Protestant, if not a friend of popery and an open enemy of the pure gospel of Christ. In 1622, before he had been a bishop for a year, he ordered that no one under the decree of a bishop or dean shall preach on such deep points as predestination or election, or the universal efficacy, resistibility, or irresistibility of God's grace. Whoa. Wow. The reason this is having an effect on me is because you can see the very same thing today.
Absolutely.
Very same thing today.
And it's going to...
Yeah.
Go ahead. Excuse me.
In 1623, when Charles I ascended the throne and married Henrietta, a zealous papist, Laud, by now Bishop of London, encouraged them to oppress the Puritans and their true gospel of free grace. It really came to this that men said you might lie or swear or get drunk and little notice would be taken. But to be a Puritan or a nonconformist was to commit the unpardonable sin. In 1633, by means of political manipulation and Jesuitical intrigue, Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury. He had assumed for his party and himself unquestionable powers in the style of the papacy, which undermined even the authority of the king. Laud obtained an undivided ascendancy over Charles I, prohibited doctrinal controversy respecting Arminian tenets, and commanded the suppression of afternoon lectures, which were generally conducted by Puritan divines.
And just all this, keep in our mind now that Charles I is king. He's the king now.
Yeah.
Because he's the king, and we understand what Laud's position, and he's going to get into how.
So would it be fair to say that when Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, when it says that he obtained an undivided ascendancy over Charles I, in other words, his position as the Archbishop actually had more power than Charles I. Is that what I'm reading?
Well, it's like the Jesuits. He was able to whisper into the king's ear.
Oh, okay. He had the assent.
Yeah. He had a direct contact with the king.
Wow.
And Charles I, married a Catholic, and was opposing, as it turns out. But because it gets better. Now, this next thing you're going to read comes from William Maxwell Heatherton, History of the Westminster Assembly. It's a quote on page 63. So go ahead and continue.
Okay. The characteristics of Laud may be seen in relation to his part in the trial, sentencing, imprisonment, and torturing by the notorious Star Chamber of Dr. Alexander Leighton in London. Leighton, a courageous and plain-spoken Scotsman, declared that both King and Anglican State Church were under the laws from the Scripture. Later, he described Arminianism as the Pope's vigilant, the last and greatest monster of the man of sin, the elixir of anti-Christianism, the mystery of iniquity, the Pope's cabinet, the very quintessence of equivocation. Wow.
Well, now take this in mind, because the next thing you're going to be he's quoting out of Christopher Nest, an antidote against Arminianism, published in 1700. Because I want to make a comment, because you're going to see as time goes on how stringent they were and stiff they were. It was an all-out attack against sovereign grace. So go ahead and read that next from Christopher Ness.
A sketch of Leighton's history is given in the preface to a letter which Samuel Rutherford wrote to him while in prison. The sketch says that Leighton, because of his zeal for Presbyterian Calvinistic principles and against the innovations of Laud, was arrested in 1629 and kept in an abominable cell 16 weeks before his trial by the Star Chamber. Because of his severe distress that he had brought skin and hair almost wholly off his body, he could not attend his trial. The Star Chamber condemned the afflicted and aged divine to be degraded as a minister, to have one of his ears cut off and one side of his nose slit, to be branded on the face with a red-hot iron, to stand in the pillory, to be whipped at a post, to pay a fine of E1,000, and to suffer imprisonment until the fine was paid. When this inhuman sentence was pronounced, Laud took off his hat and, holding up his hands, gave thanks to God who had given the church victory over her enemies. The sentence was executed without mercy, and Leighton lay in prison till upwards of 10 years. When liberated, he could hardly walk, see, or hear. He died in 1949.
1649.
1649, so that was 20 years, because he was arrested in 1629. Wow.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
3 other brave Puritans, Burton, Batswick, and Pine, each of whom spoke openly of his own resolution to follow the Bible only, suffered similar cruelties. Henry Burton, 1578 to 1648, was one of the Puritan divines whose fate was intimately bound up with that of Laud. On April 23, 1625, shortly after Charles I acceded to the throne, Burton wrote to the king complaining that both Laud and Richard Neile, Archbishop of York, harbored Catholic sympathies. This threw him out of favor with all concerned, and was the first step in a chain of events which led to Burton's imprisonment, together with William Pine, 1600 to 1669, who confronted Laud's Arminianism, and John Bastwick, 1593 to 1654. All 3 men were condemned in 1636 to have their ears chopped off and to be imprisoned for life, together with sundry fines and other penalties. Pine's ears were only partially lopped, but he suffered the additional indignity of being branded on the cheeks with the letter SL, seditious libeler, and great numbers reduced to entire destitution because they dared to write against Laud's popish ceremonies.
End of quote. Into that. Well, you can see. This is all leading. What this leads to is eventually the English Civil War with Oliver Cromwell. So, and this is where it's heading, because finally they do stand up, and because Charles I wanted to completely eliminate the Parliament, and
this is the first time. This is the first time, in all honesty, I've ever read this particular time of history being linked strictly to Arminianism. I'm going to be honest with you. I've heard this history more spoken of in a broad area, more like just Roman Catholicism versus the Reformers. But here, this author is being very specific that it is Arminianism they're coming against, which is the same as Roman Catholicism. But my point is, this is so different because we described yesterday what Arminianism is. It's a man-centered works salvation versus a sovereign grace salvation. Anyway,
Larry, it's the first time also for myself I've known of the English Revolution and Oliver Cromwell, but I didn't understand what they were fighting.
Right, exactly.
See, in other words, and they were using Arminianism as a probe. In other words, they used Arminianism because Arminianism and Catholicism are the same.
Right, exactly.
See, and the people in the streets, we even to this day don't understand that the ecumenical movement is nothing but Arminianism.
Exactly.
The ecumenical movement is nothing but Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, and these people were absolutely suffering unbelievable persecution for taking a stand against it. That's...
Yes. They paid the price. In other words, the sovereign grace and free willism was. See, this is the first time this author, because this author is Christ-centered and is centered in the gospel, that we're getting what was really going on in those 100 years of the Stuarts.
We have to try to do our best to get Richard Bennett to come on your program and talk about, because this gives me a whole, and I'm not exalting Richard Bennett, but this gives me a whole new respect for Richard Bennett because of his knowing this author and so on, okay? It really does.
Well, you can imagine the Michael de Semblin in 2016 now, we know that he's quite ill.
Right.
You could imagine the attack that he's got for putting this in a book.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's amazing he's even still alive. Really
well, the thing of it is, anymore, they're not really worried about that because they just look at it realistically. See,
like you said, it's become more of an intellectual academic inquisition today.
Yes, well, because this compare it, Michael de Semblin, the writing of this book, The Foundation's Under Attack. Now, he didn't sell 28 million books.
No.
Matter of fact, this is hard to get a hold of, and like I said earlier in the broadcast, I do have a PDF file of this part 3 that we're talking about, so people can get this in your hands and you can read it for yourself. This is just an introduction. This is an introduction because this is all new to Walt and all new to Larry. They hide the real. It isn't so much that they rewrite history. I've said this hundreds of times. It's what they leave out.
Exactly.
See, and I didn't realize that Arminianism was raising its ugly head in England.
You know, it kind of, the thought just went to my mind when you said they rewrite history. They're not writing his story; they're writing their story.
or they leave his story out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
See. I mean, that's why. I mean, and listening to Mike McGinnis last night, it was a blessing because it's all right to know this history, but you got to be Christ-centered and understand why these men had their ears lopped off and tortured.
Exactly.
Because they wouldn't give an inch. You know, and so now I fully understand why Hal Lindsey sold 28 million books, and Tim LaHaye sold. And I thought Mike McGinnis last night made a good comment. He talked about the booksellers. It sells books.
Yeah.
See, it sells books. Yeah, that was on Nothing But the Truth. It's a real interesting interview with Mike McGinnis. You know, it's on Michael's Nothing But the Truth. It was last night, so you can go into the archives and listen to that. It was a very informative hour. So go ahead, Larry.
Okay, the most godly men were ruthlessly persecuted, many having to flee the country and take refuge in Europe and the American colonies. The patience of a largely God-fearing nation finally was exhausted, and the people rebelled. This precipitated the English Civil War. In the events preceding this national disaster, Laud was impeached on November 3rd, 1640. A few days earlier, the Earl of Stafford, who was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and a Papist, was also impeached. It was discovered that the two had been in league for 12 years. Papers seized demonstrated that these men were indeed administrators of the sovereign drug Arminianism and were prepared to go to any lengths in pursuit of their goals. Though Laud and Strafford were incarcerated in the Tower, their confederates continued to plot to capture London and Parliament itself. This plot was revealed to the Commons on May 2nd, 1641, by Mr. John Pyme. The conspirators absconded, and the usual mendacity of the captive Arminians began. However, in the same year, Arminianism was officially condemned by the House of Commons. I did not know that. That's interesting. On June 12, 1643, Parliament issued an order for an assembly of Puritan divines, chaired by William Twice, to meet at Westminster to redefine the creed and doctrine of the Church of England. This Westminster Assembly completed its work in 1646 and affirmed a strong Calvinistic position and disavowed the errors of Arminianism, Roman Catholicism, and sectarianism. Wow. And those really are, like we've talked, are all one and the same. But
right.
Of Laud and his confederates, the evangelical Bishop J.C. Ryle quote, I'm sorry, let me redo that. Of Laud and his confederates, the evangelical Bishop J.C. Ryle stated, quote, had half the zeal he displayed in snubbing Calvinists, persecuting Puritans, promoting Arminians, and making advances toward Rome been shown by Anglican divines in propagating evangelical religion, it would have been a great blessing to the Church of England, end quote. To which we add, to all the Church in England, but God was and is sovereign in all human history. Okay, that's good. After the Civil War, 1642.
Just comment.
Yes.
Go ahead. See, after the Civil War from 1642 to 1651. See, it went on for 9 years. In other words, what the king was trying to do, you know, he didn't want to listen to the Parliament. See, the Parliament was against him. See, and you know, and something came to me last night. I've heard this, and I think I heard Michael Adams say that all wars are about religion, not just one war. All wars are about religion. And that's what this war was about. It was the Puritans, against they were protesting Rome's doctrines. And it went on, and Cromwell's army won, and they captured the king, but the king escaped, and he went to Scotland, and he amassed another army. So they had to go out on the field and fight again, and they beat the king's army again. This time, they made sure he didn't escape. They put him on trial, found him guilty, and executed him. And like Stuart Crane, I heard this from Stuart Crane, and when they lopped his head off, they found that it didn't run blue, it run red. In other words, it was the first time in history that a government, had rose up with common law and found the king guilty and executed him. And of course, Cromwell today, some of the things that are written about Cromwell, I mean, they buried him, and 30 years later, they dug him up and chopped his head off. Cromwell. But like Stuart Crane said, the difference between the king and Cromwell, the king was alive and Cromwell was dead. Okay.
Yeah.
But you see the hatred. You see, and the more you understand now Arminianism and the sovereign grace, because Larry, this came to me last night. You see, the reason why the Pope hates sovereign grace is because it takes out the middleman. It takes out the middleman. In other words,
there's only one mediator between God and man. That is the man Christ Jesus, and they put in a middleman.
And they put in a middleman. What it does, and why Christ was so hated, and why Christ was crucified. He was beaten. I mean, it was why he was just hated. It's because he was putting the religious men of his time out of business.
Right. He was proclaiming that he was the eternal Son of God.
That's right. And that's why the king lost his head. And if you go and do search on this, Charles I, in England, when you read stories about Oliver Cromwell and the king, it's amazing how they whine about killing the king. Because you see, like Stuart Crane said, when I listened to this lecture when I was out on the truck between 1991 and 2001, you see, when they lopped the king's head off, that was the end of divine right. That was the birth of America. Because America, there was an element in America. They didn't want a king, see, and they didn't want a pope to rule them. And see, if our government was not full of evil doers, and if man was capable of governing himself, you see what would happen. Just a second, I got a distraction here. I lost my train of thought. Somebody's trying to call me on Skype. I'm just ignoring it. It'll go away.
I hear you.
But no. See,
what you were saying is it's just there was a preoccupation with this. The king that was ruling was what sort of followed as far as what particular religious idea took the foothold. I mean, like you said, this whole Civil War was over this very issue.
And now I got my train of thought back. In other words, when I was out on the truck, when they impeached Bill Clinton. There's only been 2 presidents impeached, and
Right.
some of the Americans, when you talk to Americans, will say that they'll argue with you that Clinton wasn't impeached. He wasn't impeached. In other words, and the vote went to the Senate whether to throw him in the street.
Right. Right.
But we know that the Pope, they run the Senate. They don't care what goes on in the Congress because they control the Senate.
Right. Right.
And in other words, there wasn't enough moral men in America, because I had done all kinds of research on Bill Clinton, and I tell you, it's scary when you get into Bill Clinton and all the murders around him and everything else. And I said, the system will work. The system's going to work. But it shows you that man can't govern, because the Constitution and the Constitution and the government was set up to foresee this kind of stuff, this tyranny.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
but in other words, there wasn't enough. When you understand what's happening now in 2016, there's not enough moral men in Washington D.C. to uphold morals.
Right. Right. Well,
See?
and like you said, there's a Jesuit consensus. I mean, that's what the Jesuits run the show.
They run the show. And see, the reason why they're not interested in Walt Stickle is because they realize that where there's a few of us. See,
Right.
the people on this call are children of God, God's elect, and they're not going to move. We're not going to move. But they know where they're at today. Now, when we're reading in this book right now, they didn't have complete control of Arminianism. See, it was a war going on.
Back and forth, yeah.
You could almost say that the English Civil War was about Arminianism.
Yeah.
Was part of the element, and that's why you can say that every single war is about religion. If you look deep enough, or if you look and you scratch long enough, it's going to be about religion.
Yeah, religion. It seemed like it was like a big old grandfather clock with the pendulum on one side, sovereign grace, and the other side, Arminianism, swinging back and forth, back and forth.
It's either going to be Christ-centered or man-centered.
Yeah.
And in other words, and we're not moving. The more I understand his story, the stiffer my legs get. And now I've said this before in past. Our knees as children of God, our knees don't bow to any man.
Right. Exactly.
And that's why I enjoyed listening to Mike McGinnis. He likes to be called Mike McGinnis.
Yeah. Yeah,
See?
He doesn't like titles, he won't, and when he said when you go into your church, it's hard to see who is the teacher, because we all have our gifts in the church, and there's not one, in other words, it's not popery.
That's right. Because soon as they don't want anybody in their assembly to be a pope. And what's happened through Arminianism, we've got thousands of popes.
Exactly.
And
that's really a good point. That's really a good point.
And so, anyway, if you want to continue, I forget where we left off there.
Okay, I'm in the third paragraph. After the Civil War, 1642 to 1651, the monarchy was restored, and Charles II, son of Charles I, and his French queen, Henrietta Maria, ascended the throne of England. Like his father, Charles II was married to a Roman Catholic, Catherine of Braganza. The Jesuit and Arminian influence was restored to the court of the monarch.
I got a comment now. See, James II, brother of Charles II, and he mentions the Glorious Revolution. Or did I speak too soon? Read another paragraph.
James II, brother of Charles II, succeeded him and attempted to reestablish the Church of Rome in England. He promoted Catholics to high office and put 7 leading bishops on trial for refusing to allow his declarations to be read out in all the churches. His actions stirred up long-standing public fears of a return of popery. The Protestant opposition, represented by 7 prominent noblemen, were emboldened to invite William of Orange to assume the crown and his wife James' elder daughter to become Queen Mary II. Thus, by the grace of God, began the glorious and bloodless Revolution of 1688 in England and Scotland. The Bill of Rights was enacted the following year, restoring Parliament's proper powers and securing the Protestant throne and the Reformed religion established by law.
Okay, now the author, he's covering, listen, in 4 pages, he's covered a lot of ground. But the important thing, he stayed on target. The most important is what is he was talking about the enemy. He was talking about Arminianism and how it was trying to take seat. So when he mentions, all he says is, by the grace of God, begin the glorious and bloodless revolution. It's something that it needs to be written. I mean, an author, a younger author, a little book could be written about these 100 years, and more written about the Glorious Revolution. Why was it called the Glorious Revolution? Because it was bloodless. And why did James II peacefully get on a boat and go to France? He was king. So you ask yourself, why did he do that? He was getting there was so much pressure because he had passed the Declaration of Indulgence, and he was appointing Catholics to head offices, and he was getting so much, the country was up in an uproar. And he got so much pressure that he had to get out, he had to go to France. Why did he go to France? Because his daddy lost his head for doing the same thing. He went to France to save his neck. And what was it all about? It's because he had married a Catholic. And in other words, and the English people were afraid of a Catholic dynasty. And so even, and what's interesting is the Declaration of Indulgence and the Declaration of Independence in 1776 are related. What they were unsuccessful to do in 1688, they were unsuccessful. Because the Declaration of Indulgence was the same as the Declaration of Independence. They wanted freedom of religion. They wanted to give equal footing to the Roman Catholics, and it caused the Glorious Revolution. What they were unsuccessful to do in 1688, they were successful in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution.
I got a question here. Help me out here. Now, James the First, if I'm reading this correctly, James the Second, James the Second's elder daughter was William of Orange's wife, right? In other words,
they replaced the king with
William of Orange.
With William of Orange, because they were Protestant.
Right. And it says, trying to get this straight in my mind, William of Orange to assume the crown, and his wife, James's elder daughter, to become Queen Mary II. So William the Orange was queen, and James's elder daughter was Queen Mary. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but they were see they were Protestant. In James II, on paper, he's posing as a Protestant, but he married a Catholic.
Right, and he was pro-Catholic, wasn't he?
And he was pro-Catholic. Yeah. We could see that with his Declaration of Indulgence and appointing Catholics to head positions in government. Yeah. See, and that's what caused the Glorious Revolution. In other words, I'd like to know a little bit more about. I'm going to have to do a little bit more study on this William of Orange. He obviously was very much Protestant. Yes, he was. Yes, he was. Yes,
he was very God used him in an instrumental way of a part of this process of restoring, the Protestant throne. I mean, yeah.
You see, in this, we're going to be ending the broadcast here because we're in the next tomorrow. We're going to be talking about. We're going to take off with persecutions in France, and this is interesting. It gets even more interesting.
Because much more than today. I tell you, I feel like I've been. A lot of gaps have been covered in this short little chapter.
Well, it's the same with me, Larry. I got up at 5 o'clock this morning, and I read this, and I was the same as you. I mean, I didn't. You see, they cover up why the Civil War, the English Civil War. It's no different than the American Civil War. It wasn't over states' rights. It wasn't over slavery. It was about religion.
Exactly.
See, it was about religion.
Specifically, I mean, we about the same kinds of religion controversies. A man-centered religion, or yeah.
And in other words, what did we get in 1776? We got a universal government. We did not get a Protestant government. Now, that didn't change the people in the streets, but what we got is a man-centered religion. We got a government born by the Arminianism. How does he say? It was we got an Arminianist government.
Right.
I mean, in other words, and you see what they've been doing. What the Jesuits have been doing, and what the reason for the Civil War was to kill as many Protestants as possible. They got a war between the South and the North. Now, the South was predominantly Protestant, and most of the Catholics were in the North, but it was still a war against. It was still a war against Protestants. And look what Sherman did on the March to the Sea in Georgia.
Oh yeah.
I mean that he committed genocide on the public. And people try to get into this battle, and they're still, and they want to talk about states' rights and liberty and state rights and slavery. It wasn't about that. It was about religion. To destroy, and then after the Civil War, what was in the next chapter we're going to be covering? That's when Charles Finney, D.L. Moody.
Yeah,
I mean,
all of the Arminians started just taking over. John Wesley and the whole mess. Yeah.
Yes, that was and also I realized. A lot of people try to get into this and be kind of romantic about the Civil War. But listen, they planned on who was going to win the Civil War before they started the war. Okay? In other words, and the proof of it is this. On December 2nd, 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, They put up freedom on top of the Capitol building and give a 47-gun salute in honor of John Carroll, who had died 47 years prior. That Civil War was figured out before it even started who was going to win it. But it did what they designed it to do. Look what it did to America. I mean, did we get stronger because of the Civil War?
Absolutely.
No, we didn't get stronger. It weakened us spiritually.
Absolutely.
It was about a spiritual war. It was the Pope's war. It was the Jesuits.
Just like the Vietnam War was a Pope's war. Was
Yes.
What they call it, Spellman's War,
That's right. They call it Spelly's War in cartoons. It was in newspapers. People were reading their newspapers, and it was called Spelly's War. The North was predominantly Catholic. North Vietnam.
Right.
I mean, it was just another excuse for genocide. It was just another. And then in 1990, we had Rwanda. Identical.
And here we go again. We got Rick Warren directly involved in this
Arminianist,
purpose-driven nation, and he's just a puppet of Rome.
Just a puppet. And just dances when they pull a chain, boy, he dances, and he sells over.
He did the prayer at the inauguration of Obama too. Remember that? Rick Warren was the one that did the prayer. Yeah.
And he also, on the first election, he was the, what do you call it, the debater. I mean, he was the orator of the debate between Obama and who was the other one?
The guy that. Yeah, I can't think of his name.
I can't think of his name now. In other words, what I want to remind, I was going to make a comment about that because he was the Republican. He ran with Sarah Palin. What was his name?
He's the guy that was supposedly he was the military. He was tortured in the military and.
Yes.
I can't
but they asked him. Rick Warren asked him, well, first of all, they asked Obama the question, when does life begin? And Obama, he said, "Oh, I don't get paid enough money to answer questions like this."
that's out of my jurisdiction or something. Yeah, the guy's name was John McCain that he was running.
John McCain. Yes, John McCain. Okay, one thing I'll say for John McCain, he asked John McCain, when does life begin? And John McCain said conception. And by the way, every once in a while I don't say much to liberal women, but I have talked to liberal women, and in both cases that I talked to them, I kept asking them the question. I said, you know enough about life. I said, when does life begin? And they go on to a little episode about and I would just keep asking the question, when does life begin? And it starts at conception. That's an easy question to ask, and in other words, that's how ridiculous we are in 2016. So we got a little away from the book, but we're finishing the broadcast because tomorrow we're going to be covering persecutions in France, and it's really interesting. I mean, this set me back. It's amazing what they have done. And I'll say this to the people listening here today. Who was St. Louis named after? Do some research. And I mean, it's amazing that they'll actually bring this out, and this author brings it out. He doesn't bring out what I just asked. But it's who was king. It's King Louis the 14th of France. Anyway, but anyway, I was I got just as much out of this morning as you did, Larry, because I'm telling you, I didn't. It just took me back when I started realizing, and now, especially last night, and listening to Mike McGinnis,
Yeah.
And also today at Michael Adams and Larry Phillips are doing a study on Isaiah, and it's going to be at 4:00 Eastern Standard Time, and that's so you can. It's an interesting. I've enjoyed listening to that study myself. And anyway, Larry, I appreciate you. Helping me with this, because I said to my,
just like I said, you have much more grasp on. I'm kind of weak in this part of history, and so that's why I'm really glad that you were there today, because this was kind of a shock for me to go through.
Well, but really the truth of it is, Larry, the gate goes both ways. I mean, Arminianism. Arminianism, it just so happens that it's not a new word in your vocabulary. It was, and I can say this 6 months ago. I mean, I didn't understand Arminianism. See, I mean, when you understand Arminianism now, when you read the Declaration of Independence, boy, it makes perfect sense.
Well, what's been helpful for me, especially today, is to see the temporal governments lining up on one side or the other, and it's so distinctive. That's been a great help to me. So,
well, what about 1776? Did they line up with sovereign grace or Arminianism?
No. All men are created equal. Oh my, here we go.
Yeah, I mean, and how many people understand that? Because you see, Luther knew all about Arminianism.
Oh man, did he ever?
We learned that in the day before, and here Walt Stickle is 71 years old and learned about Arminianism 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And then when you had a chance to visit with a Lutheran minister, I mean, that's of old. Larry, come on, Larry.
That was then. This is now.
That was then. Now, But anyway, it was this hour was exciting for me too, Larry, because and like I said, I've heard his story, but never in the perspective that Mike McGinnis said last night.
Yeah.
And so when today it was fitting for today's broadcast, okay?
Yes, it was.
And I will say this, by tomorrow I'm going to have a link up where you can get the third part of this book in a PDF file. And so you can read along, plus you can do your own research. You can research some of these things, because you can't take it away from the author, like he mentions the Glorious Revolution, but it's a whole other chapter. It would be we can when we read the book, but he couldn't do that when he was writing his book, or his book would have been 700-800 pages long.
Right.
Yeah, and the fact of it is, this man is from the UK. Michael Dissemblin, and he knows Reformation, his story. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to bring this to a close, and God bless. Love you all. Bye for now.